Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Thank you for joining me here on YouTube. If we haven't met before, my name is Gem, I live in the UK and I create jewellery primarily using wire, sometimes beads, sometimes gemstones, sometimes a little bit of imagination, something from my dreams, who knows. For today's free wire tutorial here on YouTube, I want to share a design with you that has been requested so many times. It's this piece that I'm wearing now, and I'm going to show you how to create the centerpiece, and obviously you can add on any beads that you prefer. It's the Deco geometric pendant, and it isn't tricky to make at all, but it is rather an eye-catching design. Now, I'm hugely inspired by lots of things in art, in history, in nature, but the Art Deco period of design is one of my absolute favourites, along with Egyptian antiquities and Art Nouveau. There are lots of things that inspire me, Japanese art as well, but Art Deco has been a theme that has stayed with me forever and ever. So many people have asked to see the creation of the pendant, the feature section of the pendant, following on from a video I did where I made these earrings, which I will pop a link in at the end of the video if you fancy having a go at those. So let's have a closer look at the piece we're going to make today down at the board. So I'm going to show you the technique, which means that you can make either with beads or without. You could make a very, very simple veil. These are just twisted loops at the top, or you could have an elongated drop, or you could turn all of that weaving into a woven veil like I have on the copper example. So I'm going to be working today in copper wire in 1mm, which is equivalent to 18 gauge, and 0.4mm, which is equivalent to 26 gauge. We don't use huge amounts of these, and I just want to show you a quick grab bag of beads that I found from my stash of miscellaneous beads that I think would look great in this design. So I might strand a few of those together at the end of the tutorial just to see what they might look like together. Onto my finer gauge wire. A little bit later on you can add some beads if you want to have beads in the design. You don't have to. I think it looks quite effective without. So without further ado, let's have a look at the pieces of wire we're going to need today. The primary section of the design is made using 3 lengths of that 1mm gauge, which is equivalent to 18 gauge. I've got 2 lengths of around about 6 inches and a single length of around about 10 inches. Now 10 inches is a little bit longer than you actually need, but it just means that you've got lots of space to play around with the design later on in case you change your mind about how you'd like that to look. So the first thing that we're going to do, as with all of my wirework designs, is ensure that the wire is warm and smooth and straight. So as we're going to be trimming the wire, I'm not overly worried about making sure that those end sections are completely flush, as long as they're not going to cause you harm as you're running them between thumb and forefinger. Don't worry about making those flush just yet. So I've got those 2 6-inch lengths ready, and the 1 10-inch length. Now that's a little bit kinked in the middle, so one of my tricks for getting that smoother is to push up, and you can see I'm actually deforming the wire into a curved shape as I go. And what that does is it gets rid of that little kinking in the middle before I then just pull that to a nice straight shape. So the main portion of this design is to create 3 triangles. I'm just going to move these off the board because otherwise they will go flying. We're going to create 3 triangles which are very, very close in size. Now the 2 shorter pieces of wire is where we're going to start. I'm going to find as close to the centre as I possibly can and turn an angle up. Doesn't matter if it's identical, because with 6 inches of wire we have enough to work with to make sure that that's all going to fit quite nicely. I'm going to turn the exact same angle, and the way to do that is just to start with an angle and then see how much smaller it needs to be. You could, if you wanted to, do that mathematically, but I'm really not very good at maths. So what we want is for the 3 pieces of wire to fit inside each other really neatly. So you can see there's a tiny bit of a gap down at the bottom there, which means that one of my angles is out slightly. So what I can do is sharpen up that second point just by opening the design up a little bit and then pushing that more closely back together. What that should mean is that you refine the point slightly so that it should sit more closely down inside the other wire. I've made that slightly too narrow an angle, So you can just open that out very, very gently until they fit as flush as possible. You will obviously spend as much time as you need to get these flush and beautiful. If you find that it's too much of a round angle, we can just open that out and close that up again a couple of times. You've got a couple of bites of the cherry because you warmed the wire, which means that you can spend that time getting it absolutely perfect. So once you're happy with the first two, we're going to find the centre approximately of the longer length of wire. Almost knocked all the beads flying on the floor, which is par for the course with me if you have followed my tutorials before. So I'm going to find approximately the centre and then turn that over until I get a nice sharp V shape down at the base. You can open and close that just a couple of times to try and refine that slightly. Using the finest point pliers you have is a boon. If you prefer to use these, which are chain nose pliers, they're finely tapered. You might get a slightly finer point on those first time out. It's entirely up to you depending on what tools you have available. But we're looking to have the longest of those three pieces of wire sitting on the inside of the other two pieces. Now the angles aren't quite right at the moment, but I want to show you what we're working towards and you can refine this as you go. So we don't want those wires to be splaying out, we want them to be sitting flush. So you'll need to take a little bit of extra time, which I'm going to do right now, to get those as perfect as possible. So it really is a case of just opening and closing very carefully in small movements until you get these wires stacked, as it were. So we're just going to stack one inside the other with the longest section of wire in the middle, until everything sits nice and flush. So I will take just an extra few minutes off camera just to get that nice and smooth. It'd be very boring for you to watch me do that. So I've just taken a couple of moments making sure that those angles are as close to repeated as I possibly can. One of the keys to making the design look neat and tidy is getting those edges as straight as possible. They don't have to be straight all the way along, but the first inch or so, the straighter that is, the easier it will be for you to create those good angles. So let's have a look at where I got to and see what you think. So you can see I've worked towards getting these nestling as close as I possibly can. One of the things that you can do to make this a little bit less tricky is to hammer the central sections. Now I have a very teeny tiny steel block which the lovely Fleur gave to me. And I've got a lovely light hammer as well. So I'm just going to nestle those wires one inside the other. And we're only working really on the first inch or so, or however large you want the design to be. So by comparison, it is about this much from the point to where I'm going to make the first turn in. So I'm just going to make sure that these wires are sat side by side, none of them are overlaying any of the others. I'm going to push that down. You could use tape if you wanted to, and I'm just going to tap down very delicately on the angles and the first inch or so of wire, just to make sure this is as neat and as tidy as it possibly can be. Now I'll be honest with you, I wasn't quite sure how much the camera was going to wobble during that, so we probably won't spend too much time on this, but you get the idea. So what we've done is we've applied a little bit of work hardening to our copper to make sure that those angles match as best as they possibly can, and you've got the points in the angle that you want them to be. Now we don't go too far along because we're going to bend the wire next, so let me take that block out of the way and make sure the hammer's out of the way too. So if we start with the uppermost, which is the long wire section, and I'll show you what that looks like on the piece, and just put that into the correct orientation. You can see that the piece with the long wire is actually the smallest of the triangles. So if you like to, what you can do is form those angles first. You need to make sure that you don't hammer too far up, Otherwise, your arrow shape is going to be absolutely vast. If you hammer too far up, then the wire is weak when you start to put the angles in. So I'm going to show you now how I prefer to make that first angle bend, and also how to match it on the second side. So by eye, I'm going up around about an inch. You could measure to make sure that you get the exact same distance on both sides, but I'm going to push an angle over, like so. If you wanted to measure, you absolutely can, because that makes your life so much easier. I'm just going to eyeball it and push the other line over. What I can do now is judge by eye whether or not one of those sides is slightly longer, and it looks to me like the right hand side is slightly longer. So I'm just going to open the design out very, very gently and push that angle up just a little bit. And what I'm doing is opening and closing the tip of my pliers just up at that right angle, and I'm moving it up a very small amount. Now, if you had used a ruler and a marker pen, you wouldn't have to do that. I'm eyeballing it today because it's very, very exciting to see if I get it right or not. So the next thing I'm going to do is to turn these long segments upwards. Now, if you're going to add a bead, you need to leave the distance between these two upright angles far enough apart rather, so that you can accommodate the bead. Now, I've got loads of beads to choose from for this design, but I'm going to recreate the one just here. But you can obviously use whatever size bead you desire. The one that we're going to add in later is around about 5 millimeters rather, and it's a faceted round. So if I pop that back out of the way for now, what I'm going to do is pop those upward angles in. So I'm going to bring that reasonably close to the middle and turn my first right angle, flip the design over, and do the exact same thing on the other side. Now, if you haven't left yourself quite enough space, you can use that very same technique to just nibble along at the angle to make that slightly change its position. Now, I haven't done a very neat job there, but you get the point. So I'm just going to refine that angle slightly on both sides and try to make sure that my uprights are indeed upright. That one's very definitely on the wonk. I'm looking for reasonably sharp angles, because obviously it's a geometric design, so we don't want anything too soft. We want to celebrate those angles. So if I look at my design now, and I pop in with the beads I want to use, we can just see that they're going to fit reasonably well between those two rail tracks that are going to form the bail later. So we need to now use the wire that we had in the middle of the stack. You may find that they don't stack exactly in a different order, so I tend to just use them in the same design. What I need to do now is just pick these up and pinch them together very, very firmly so that one sits inside the other. The next angle that we're going to make is right above the first angle on the first arrowhead. So if I pop my pliers into position and turn that across, what you'll see is that if I just push that down with my finger, we're snaking around the outside, and that's the size that we want to repeat. We want them to nestle or to nest. So I'm just going to refine the angle now by taking it further than I wish to, opening it back out, and then closing it one more time. Now again, you could measure this distance and measure it on the other side. Again, I'm going to be a rebel and use my eyeball to judge whereabouts that might form. So I can see again, it's too short on one side. So I'm just going to very, very gently push that up a little bit until it sits where I want it to. The proof is in the pudding, obviously, so we're going to let that sit over the top. And I'm a little bit shy on the right-hand side again. So I just push that up ever so slightly. We will get to a point where that nestles around the outside of the first arrowhead formation that we've made. So the next thing that we need to do is to turn a bend following the outer line of our first form. So each time we add a triangle onto the form, it needs to go around the outside, so it's ever so slightly larger each time. The central arrowhead shape with the long tails coming away is the smallest, and then each one is just a little bit larger as you move along. So again, this is something that you may want to spend a little extra time just refining that shape, making sure that you're happy with all of those angles before you move on to the next section. So I'm just going to give this a little bit more time, and then I will come back to you when I've recreated the same design on the third wire. So what I'm going to do is just take a couple of minutes off camera to make sure that I'm happy that each of those triangle or arrowhead shapes nestles inside the next one down. I'll show you exactly what that looks like before we take our next step of today's tutorial. So what we're looking for is to have the cascading sizes. The long-tailed arrow shape is the smallest. Our middle wire sits over the top of that, so that the smallest one fits right inside the next one up, and then the next one up fits inside the largest one. So I haven't done anything that I didn't show you on the medium-sized one. They do like to lock together, that's quite amusing. There we go. So the next thing that we need to do is to turn uprights on each of the number 2 wire and the number 3 wire so that they fit over the shoulders of the preceding sized arrow. So let me show you what I mean by this. I'm going to take the smallest arrow with the long tails and pop the medium-sized arrow over the top. Now what I might do just to make life easier is just draw one of those wires down out of the way for a second so you can see exactly what we're looking to do. So I've taken the middle wire and laid it over the top of the smallest wire. What I need to do is to have a right angle bend come up outside the shoulder of the smallest wire. So if I pop my fine tip pliers just underneath that middle-sized wire where I want to make the bend, drop the middle-sized wire, and then I can put an upright just here. Now it is again, because we warmed this section of wire earlier, you will be able to take a couple of moments to make sure that that fits exactly where you want it to. And again, we're going to make some straight lines with these uprights and really good, strong, solid angles. This is a geometric design, so we do want some nice angles to be visible. So I would repeat that on the second side before taking the smallest one out of the way and then bringing the largest one into position and repeating the exact same process. So again, if I just smooth one of these wires out of the way, drop the largest wire, the largest size triangle shape over the middle wire, bring those pliers up and underneath, and then turn the angle just where that sits outside the shoulder of the next size down. Exactly the same way we did just a moment ago. So pop my pliers in, drop that middle wire, and turn up a nice firm angled bend. And again, take a little bit of time to make that nice and firm and to make sure that you've not lost any of those beautiful angles. So if I just nestle these together for a moment, that's 1 and 2 and 3 of them all sitting side by side. I'll repeat the second side off camera in a second and I'll get these all nice and straight, but you can see that one is sitting inside another is sitting inside the third. If I push that down onto my hand, you can see exactly what we're aiming for, and we're keeping those arrowhead shapes pointing centrally downwards. So it really only took about 60 seconds just to get those second angles on the other side of the neck of each of those arrows turned up, and then just a couple of moments just to refine those to make sure that they all nest one inside the other. I'm going to show you what that looks like and also how you can hammer the design a little bit further. If you're happy with having the tool markings on your finalised piece, then it's a really nice effect. If not, then you can use a nylon hammerhead. I actually quite like the hammered look, so let's have a look at what that looks like now. So you can see that the rough arrowhead shapes are all in position, and those angles just nest up at the top either side of that central train track, which will become our bail later. Now I'm going to bring in my nano block again and just push the design back down flat. Just want to make sure that none of the wires are crossing over. I'm really happy with how that's looking. So if I spin this around sideways, because I'm right dominant, I need to hammer from the right. I just need to make sure that these are all flat. No wires are crossing over before I add a little bit of work hardening at these angles. So it's the outer of the triangular form and then where it turns to become an upright. Now what I don't want to do is apply any work hardening on the upright sections. So we're primarily hammering the outer angles. and very, very gently heading towards these upright bends. We're not hammering them at all because we want some fluidity in these outer two wires. So at this point, if anything isn't quite lining up, you've got one last opportunity. So I can see that this middle wire just here is ever so slightly elevated. So I'm just going to push that down. Make sure that everything is nice and flat before I reassemble those three arrowhead shapes, push them back down onto the block, and I can see that everything is now sitting where I want it to sit, and all of those angles are as good as I want them to be. So let's move the block and the hammer back out of the way and pop these down on the board. So the next stage, we're going to take that central, smallest arrow but longest ends and pop that out of the way. And what we're going to do is attach the largest of the triangles to the middle-sized triangle. Now what we're going to do at this stage is make sure that those uprights, and this is the reason we didn't hammer them, make sure that they're perfectly upright, and we're going to trim them to, let's think, around about 5 or so millimeters, perhaps a little bit longer. So let me just trim that away, capturing those tails, and this is the point at which we're making sure that we've got flush cuts. So that is around about 5 to 6 millimeters in length. In terms of inches, my gosh, that's around about an eighth and a bit, something like that. That's not even a measurement. So what I need to do now is to make hooks out of these two small upright sections, and having 2 pairs of pliers will help me. If you do have a flat pair of pliers, what you can do is grip all the way along and get this done in fewer movements. But if you don't have some these were so cheap, they were like £1, maybe $1.50, something like that. They weren't expensive. You can use your regular chain nose pliers. What we're looking to do is to hold the pliers so that they sit just under halfway up. However, if you don't have those lovely flat pliers, your regular chain nose pliers will do. What we're looking to achieve is to hold the right hand side of the largest arrowhead shape so that your pliers cross around about just under halfway up that little tail section. We then use a second pair of pliers to turn the wire over, firstly to a right angle, like so. Let's take these pliers out of the way. That didn't help, did it? So you can see we've got a very soft right angle to begin with. Now it's very tempting to do this in one set of pliers. I promise you it's a much neater result if you use 2. So again, now onto the left hand side. We're going to support the straight edge. I'm just going to show you in the mirror image here. We're supporting the entirety of that shoulder section and about halfway up the section of wire which we just trimmed. Once we've got a really lovely grip on that, we're going to take that little tail of wire and turn it over so that you get this start of a hook shape. It doesn't need to be a perfect right angle. This is not a part that we need to stress and worry about. The next thing that we're going to do is to grip a hold of the upright section. Now you can go across sideways with your chain nose pliers if you don't have the large flat pliers. So you can just give that a bit of a grip, go across sideways, and then continue to make this into a hook shape. So let's draw that down, draw it down and around. Much easier when you're not having a camera in the way. So if I take the second pair of pliers out of the way, what we're looking to achieve is to bring that down into much more of a hook. So if I show you that on the first side as well, drawing that down until you get these double hooks. Now they do need to have the same distance from the upturned angle to the top of the hook shape, otherwise it all hangs on the wonk. So I'm going to give that a little bit of a squish and a squeeze to get it nice and strong before bringing the middle-sized arrowhead into position. And what we're going to do is link the two together. Outside of the 2 uprights on that middle wire and get that to sit down, and you can see already how the design is starting to work. Now, if I just hold that on without turning the tails over, you can see that we're slightly wonky somewhere. So this is a really good time to just try that out. It may be that you need to push the wire down ever so slightly on one shoulder before popping that back on. That's much more centralised and straight. So once I'm happy with that, all we're going to do is to close up that small tail. Now this takes a little bit of close photography, so I'm going to ask my technical team to zoom in slightly for this. Let me just get it into position before just closing up the section that we turned over the top and giving that a bit of a squish to make sure it grips a hold of the shoulder section of the next size up. So I'm going to do that on the other side, just close that up slightly so that it nestles around. And again, you might need to just play with that until it sits as perfectly as you want it to. Now I just ever so slightly bent that, so I'm just going to straighten that back out like so. But that's the first section done. All you would do for the next one along is exactly the same thing. So you can see how that's going to work once we have turned the angles on the uprights. It's going to nestle just like so. So it's basically repeating the same thing. I'll just do that off camera. So we're trimming the shorter wires, not the longer wires. We're leaving those intact. So we would trim these down, and instead of 5 to 6 millimeters, we're going to leave a slightly longer tail this time because things are getting a little bit tighter in terms of what we need to do. So instead of 5 to 6 millimeters, we're going to go for about 7 to 8 millimeters. You can always take a little bit more off if it's not enough. Putting it back on is the problem. So I'm going to repeat exactly what I did with the first section, and I'll join you back in a second. So I've just taken a couple of minutes to make sure that I'm happy with all of those angles and that everything is linking together neatly. So let's have a look at where we're at now. So you can see the main part of today's tutorial is already complete. Just by linking those 3 arrowhead shapes together, cascading up, we've made our deco inspired geometric pendant. If you want to add a little bit of weaving to the neckline, you absolutely can. Now I've chosen to work with copper because for one reason it shows up reasonably well on camera, but I also love with basically how it performs for me. It's smooth and fluid when I want it to be, but I can work hard on it to be really firm and rigid. So I'm going to show you how to add beads in. You could indeed just go for a plain weave if you wanted a more simplistic bail. What I've done with this design is I have preloaded onto my wire, and the wire I'm using is 0.4 millimeter or 26 gauge. I'm just going to discard this end bit because it's kinked. That can be used for tying things together later. 0.4 millimeter, 26 gauge, and I'm working off the reel as and where possible to avoid the wastage that I just incurred. So what I will do here is I will lay a small section around about just under an inch over the top of one side, and I'm going to give that a good couple of turns around one of those uprights. Now for me, being right-handed, it's easier for me to start off on this side, and I think what I'm going to do is go for 5 coils around that wire. Now they're quite loose at the moment, they're quite baggy, so we're just going to make sure that they're all nice and neat and tidy before we move on. Before just giving that a quick scooch down and making sure that they are indeed neat and tidy. I'm going to bring that down, make sure that that last naughty little tail is tucked away, tighten the coil of wire up, and just push that as far towards where the linking points occur as possible. I'm then going to bring in my first bead and allow that to sit between the 2 uprights. Now I started on the top of the wire, which is currently on the left side of the screen, and I'm going to go to the top of the wire that's on the right hand of the screen. So this is a form of channel setting. It's not the same form of channel setting that some people show in heady designs. It's a different type. So I'm going to rotate 5 times around this side, sorry. So that's 3, that's 4, and that's 5. And then I'm going to draw those 5 coils neatly and tidily all up together before taking the wire underneath. My finer gauge wire is now travelling underneath both of those 2 uprights. I'm going to keep that tension so that the next bead will also fit in the gap. Wire starts underneath on the upper as it looks on your screen now, and it travels to underneath on the lower wire as it looks on your screen now. And then I'm going to wrap another 5 times. Without pulling too hard, if you get a little bit over tense and over exuberant with your tension at this position, you can draw those 2 tram lines too close together, and then you can't sight the next bead into position. So you need to preload the number of beads that you want to sit in the neck of the design before you start the process. So I put 3 on because I love the number 3 in jewellery, and it looks really nice just to add enough depth to the design. Now I'm using 5mm faceted black glass beads. Again, the wire is coming underneath, to underneath. Quite often when we're doing a figure of 8 weave, we're going down the centre, so we start on the top and finish up underneath. But for this weave, we're always going from the underside to the underside, and then in reverse by comparison. So I'm going to wrap 5 times here, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Just very, very gently holding on to that wire in its final position going across, before adding in the last of our neckline beads. Push that into position and then finish off with 5 wraps on the upper of those 2 tramline wires, which were, if you remember, the central of our arrowheads, the smallest by size but the longest in length. Just give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze to make sure that's nice and neat and tidy. You've got a couple of options at this stage. What I did on this design was to draw those 2 wires together by creating an angle that comes in to bring the 2 wires side by side. I then did a little bit of a different weave just to create enough for a bail at the top there. If you don't want to do that, you can create a simplistic bail. This design has no beads. It has a length of figure of 8 weaving. It's 3 and 3, and then at the top I've very, very simply turned the wire over to create a loop, and then given each side a little bit of work hardening. So if I slip the pliers up between those 2 loops and push, squish that nice and firm, because there's no weight to this design, that will hang really quite safely, and you can just bring those back together, or you can create a split bail if you prefer. But bearing in mind this is not sealed, all we have here are 2 openable loops. Like I said, there's no weight on it. You can hang that on something now, but it will not be as strong as a completely wrapped bail like this one is. So all I did was to draw the 2 wires together, create around about 3/4 of an inch to an inch of weaving before just tying those 2 end sections together. So for this section, I think what I'll do is just show you how to start that, and then we will be done for the day. So very, very simply, draw those 2 sections of wire across each other, turn the uppermost of the 2 to an upright, turn the lowermost of the 2 to an upright, and then you can draw those 2 pieces so that they're snuggled side by side. You can undertake any weave that you desire at this point. I think I'm just going to call that a day. Trim off the end of the wire there, get my finer gauge wire out of the way before it eats the camera again. I'm just going to tidy off that cut section like so. Now if you wanted to do a naked split bail but had one that had a little bit more rigidity, we're going to bring those 2 wires side by side, so you could, as I say, you could weave into that if you wanted to. I'm just going to show you a very, very simple way. We've gone a little bit farther up than the position where we brought those 2 wires together, turning the wire forwards. What we're going to do now is grab the bail making pliers. You could use bail makers, you could use a round form. I'm just going to make them a little bit closer together and a little bit warm before we rotate that around. I think I'll go for size 5, like so. Bring both of those tails around. Whoops, oh my goodness. Whacked the camera again, what a surprise. So we've completed a circle with unwoven wire. You would obviously weave that first if you're going to have a woven bail, and then what you can do is just very, very simply wrap these 2 tails around. So because it's a split bail, you can wrap them independently or you can wrap them together. So if I pinch those 2 side by side, take one of those tails and draw it around. Now this is a design that I would never put a coil onto. We're looking for a slightly sleeker, more minimalist design. I'm just going to take that tail away. I'm going to wrap the other side around right after I just squish that tail down into position. Make sure that my loops are the same size on both sides. Take that tail slightly underneath the first, draw that around a couple of times just to fill the gap at the top. All the way around. You might need to just help that get into position because it's seen a little bit of work. Being careful of your beads. Don't squish your beads, especially glass ones. And we're going to finish that on the back. I'm going to find the central point which would be central up that line of beads, making sure you're on the back. Cut away that last little tail, and this tiny little bit on the end here, we're just going to push so that it sits down inside the design, again being mindful of those beads. And then you can either have the two naked wires as a bail by themselves at the top, or you can split those out. That's now a secure bail, like so, and just a little bit of modification to that top coil to make it neat and tidy. Art Deco, or Art Deco as I understand the rest of the world says it to me, was heavily inspired itself by Egyptian designs, so a lot of angles, but tends to be clean lines. So there are 3 examples that match the focal design on my piece today. So you could add in, I'll show you those black beads again that have just come from my stash. You could add in any of those. This is just a length of beading thread joined to some chain, whichever beads that you wanted to, or you could just put that straight onto ribbon or chain. There's a lot of glamour within Art Deco, so a little bit of sparkle, a little bit of black, but lots of clean lines. I hope that you've enjoyed the tutorial today. I will just give you a quick look at those beads and then we'll be off. I've got lots of choices to work with. I think these would be absolutely gorgeous. Where's the one that we just made together? So I would probably put those on some beading thread either side and then graduate them out maybe with some different sized pieces. Maybe a couple of quite simple sections, but still full of glitz and glamour. I'd probably finish off with a couple of slightly smaller ones. This is very easy, just to pick from a bag of random beads to make quite an effective piece of period inspired jewellery. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Lots of love, have a beautiful day, bye for now.